Take a person, take a story, take you on a journey. It's your take.
On today's Your Take, I'm joined by a Nashville resident who is a professional musician, a businessman, and a music educator. In 1996, my guest formed his own band called Jackalope Junction, who released 2 albums and received regular airplay and a review in Music Row magazine. My guest went on to embark on a solo music career and then taught full-time at a university music department. In 2013, my guest established his own private teaching studio called Nashville Guitar Guru. Here he teaches students guitar and is also involved in running workshops, a YouTube channel, publishing books. I'm joined today by the guitar guru, David Isaacs. David shares with us his musical journey from the beginnings, life in the late 1990s in a band, leaving New York City to move to America's music capital, Nashville, embarking in a career in music education, and his entrepreneurial spirit, forming Nashville Guitar Guru. Good afternoon, where you are in Nashville, USA. A very warm welcome, David, to your
Thank you
take.
so much for having me.
We're obviously going to speak in depth about your musical career as a musician and as a music teacher, which we'll obviously come on to. First of all, I wanted to go back to the very foundations and start at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Can I begin by asking you when and where you were born? And can you give us an insight into your childhood and tell us who your parents are and what they did for a living, both of them?
So I was born in Washington, D.C. in 1967. My father was a psychiatrist in private practice at that time. My mother had worked as a nurse, psychiatric nurse, but then stopped working when I was born. I was actually adopted as an infant, but didn't learn this until I was 13. But my folks, this is a whole other story and direction to head down for me to drop right at the beginning of this, because I've had this lifelong experience of getting to know my blood family and some of my blood relatives. And I very clearly feel like I am equal parts the blood family and my mom and dad that I grew up with. It's interesting how that works. But there was a lot of music in the house because my dad had gone to medical school in Holland and heard, when he was over in Europe, flamenco guitar and completely fallen in love with it. Brought a guitar back and for a while had played, never got very good, but he was very interested in that. And he was a fan of Andres Segovia. He was a fan of Doc Watson. So some of the first guitarists I remember being aware of, Chet Atkins, were people whose records he was listening to. And then my mom is from Appalachian, Kentucky, and so she grew up on all this mountain music and folk music. And my parents were both sort of typical early 60s folkies, so pre-Dylan, really. They were a little too old to be hippies, my folks. So I did hear a lot of real folk music growing up. The folk singer Gene Ritchie, who is from Eastern Kentucky, near where my mother grew up, is someone that I heard a whole lot. And so this is these old storytelling songs and ballads and things like that. And then my mother played the piano, again, not particularly well, but she was committed to it. And she loved Bartok and played a lot of Bartok. And what was the other thing that she played a lot of? The kind of folk dance type songs are the ones that I remember the most.
It's interesting, growing up in the 1960s, you mentioned coming from a musical family, but straight off, I wanted to pick up on the revelation of finding out in your early teens that you'd been adopted. What was your initial reaction when you found that out? It obviously came as a shock, but how
It's
did,
hard, yeah.
how did you feel emotionally and mentally? That's quite a lot to take on board at a young age.
It's difficult for me to fully even express that right now because there's so much wrapped up in it, of course. And then to complicate things further, without going too deep down the rabbit hole with it, my mom and dad had some issues between them. And when I was 9, I believe, my dad tried to tell me I was adopted, but he didn't quite complete the story, left a lot of questions unanswered that maybe a contemporary 9-year-old, kids being so much more sophisticated these days, might have thought to ask some questions. Well, what do you mean? But I think it was just this over my head thing. So finding out the rest of the story at least clarified a picture that made some kind of sense. But it leads to this, of course, questioning, well, who am I then if I am not you? And it sort of clarifies this sort of nagging sense of why don't I feel like I thoroughly belong here, which is something I've heard a lot of adult adoptees say later in life. And it's interesting to me how, whether this is just a coincidence or not, I've always been sort of musically omnivorous, maybe to the detriment of my career as a performer because I kept changing channels, so to speak. And so each project was different. My first solo album was radically different from Jackalope Junction. And the next one was radically different from that one. So, but if you you come to find out that you are both multi-ethnic and multicultural, because I have Latin blood, my blood father from Puerto Rico, and my birth mother split Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jewish, Eastern European on one side, and well, not Hispanic, but Spanish. My grandmother was born in Marrakesh, in Morocco, which, you come to learn this in your early 20s, and it's this, suddenly there's this whole other culture, when meanwhile I grew up knowing my mother's relatives in Eastern Kentucky, and we would go and see them in the summertime and stay. This is as country a place as you've ever seen. This is, the picture of Appalachia, with the little house tucked behind a creek, which you have to cross a bridge to get back to the main road, and there's a little bit of space between the hill on this side and the hill on that side, up the holler, as they say. So where do I choose to identify? Some people can define themselves, this is exactly who I am, and sometimes that goes to the music you play. This is who I am, this is the music I play because it's an expression of where I come from and who I am. So how do I do that? I can't do that. So you absorb this, you absorb that, and it all somehow becomes who you are much later in life when it starts to feel a little more integrated.
And that first meeting with your real parents, what was that meeting like? And are you still in close contact with them now?
I am in close contact with my birth mother. She is the one that reached out to me first. I met her in my early 20s. And that was a very gradual process of getting to know each other. She was very mindful of, I suppose, her own boundaries and mine. And so we spoke first letters and then on the telephone for a period of months before we actually met the first time. And what I recall it being is very wary. You're exposing yourself to something here which is completely overwhelming. But this was 30 years ago, and we've been close ever since. And then I did meet my blood father a couple of times, and that was, you reach a point where it's more about curiosity even at this point. You hear some stories and you try to flesh out a picture. But again, going back to someone who is exploring something as an artist, which to a degree is exploring who you are and where you pull from, what are the things that resonate with you, and feeling like, well, I can in my mind go here, but through one twist of fortune or another, I could have grown up this person with this completely different identity. So why can't I explore this, and does it even matter? You get into questions of authenticity, and people talk about cultural appropriation, and it gets very complicated. So I say, well, I, as much a mutt as the animal that was just running in and out of here, and I am as proud of it as he is. So,
David,
but it speaks to a lot,
David, we'll move on to your education. I wanted to ask you where you went to school and what are your memories from your time there, and which subjects did you excel in and why? And was music taught at your school?
I don't remember having a real strong affinity for music classes. I know that I liked to sing, and I sang to myself all the time. I had a lot of music in my head. It didn't really start to penetrate until I suppose I was 9 or 10 years old, and my mother had picked up as a hobby New England and English country dancing and contra dancing, which is not square dancing, but more lines and step. Some of these are, these old stylized, not ballroom dances, but courtly dances and things like that. And then there's Morris dancing and all that kind of folk dance stuff. So anyway, she got into that, and I love the music, which is sort of a mix of some vaguely Renaissance-sounding folk dances, and some of it is more in the realm of fiddle tunes and jigs and reels and things like that. And I really liked that music, and my mother had found a piano teacher who played for these dances, where on the piano you're doing a lot of oompa, really, but you're driving the rhythm. And this guy taught me by ear and just taught me tunes. So how to do a simple accompaniment and play the melody, and I really took to that. I didn't like when I had traditional piano lessons and it was learn this note and the next week you learn the next note. And I've taught piano that way to little kids too. That is more or less the way you do it, but for me that didn't work. I connected to it when I connected with the tunes, because the tunes stayed with me. And then guitar came a little later, and I was 14, and that was just when I fell in love with popular music, I guess. Right, where I didn't have, my folks were not tuned into pop music. So we didn't really hear it in the house. And so when I started to become aware of it, honestly, it was in 5th grade in 1977 or 8, when Kiss was huge and dominant in everything, and all my friends were into Kiss, so I started buying Kiss records. And of course, you're in 5th grade, you have, talking about kids being maybe more sophisticated now than they were then, I don't know. But I think back to the lyrics of some of these songs, and it really makes me laugh. I suppose it's not all that different from some of my students listening to hip hop when they're 13, and I want to say, do your folks know you're... But I wasn't really aware of it as music that spoke to me until a couple of years later, and then I don't know, my ears just opened up.
I wanted to continue on the topic of education and discuss attending music college where you learn classical guitar. When and where did that take place, and can you summarize your experiences and how you ended up with repetitive strain injury, which you mentioned knocked your confidence and your progress?
Well, I was a classical guitar performance major, and to tell you the truth, I don't think now that it was so much because I was so devoted to that particular area of music, so much as it, number one, gave me an organized path to follow. It gave me somewhere to go. It felt serious and sophisticated, which I think I was also kind of in love with the idea of that. But it was also rigorous and required a lot of discipline, and I learned a lot from that. So I was fortunate enough to go through first a well-organized guitar program at the Hart School of Music in Hartford, Connecticut, where they brought in world-class musicians for master classes. Yehudi Menuhin came in the first year I was there. Ron Carter, the bass player, came in the first year I was there. These are, the pinnacle of achievement, these people. And I remember playing for Oscar Ghiglia, who was an Italian classical guitarist who had been Andres Segovia's teaching assistant as a teenager. And his direct connection to that lineage. And so it was a real eye-opener. And then I spent 2 years there, came back home to New York, and finished up at City University of New York at Queens College. And that was a rigorous program, but their emphasis was on the theory and the history, and they kicked your butt with it. I went on to my master's at the Manhattan School of Music, which is a top school, and even then, the reinforcement in the theory and history I had at Queens was much more intense. You had, in fact, a jury to pass for your degree. At the end of completing all your coursework, you still had essentially like presenting a thesis, except this was just to finish your undergraduate degree. Mm-hmm. And you were given 2 large pieces of classical music and a series of questions to answer, which you had to be able to defend in both written and oral form in front of a faculty jury, which was terrifying.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But this had nothing to do with the guitar. This was just kicking your butt saying, be a musician. And I feel very fortunate being in New York at that time and having the ability to work with some of these people that I studied with, or even just was around. You play for somebody once or hear them speak once, and they say something that impacts you for the rest of your life.
In terms of our time frame, I wanted to move forward from your education to dipping your toes into the industry and the music business. We come on to 1996, and you set up your own band called Jackalope Junction, who went on to release 2 albums. Can you tell us the story of how the band was formed and how you met the other members? And can you describe the band's music and how you gained national attention through radio play in Nashville and a review in Music Row magazine?
Well, you mentioned the repetitive strain problem, which was when I finished my master's degree, I was preparing to enter a competition, a guitar competition, which is potentially a career-making move. And in the process of preparing for that, I was practicing something like 8 hours a day for several months on end, not really going out, not really doing much else, and really just worked everything too hard. The whole system sort of shut down. I had to quit playing for a little while. And I had to determine, really, was this the path I really loved, or was there something else I really wanted to do? And the answer really was that I wanted to have a band, or at least to be in a band. And I started Jackalope because I started writing songs, and I was also backing up some other people and just finding the writing my own and frankly making my own choices more satisfying. And I found the musicians just through casting around, starting off with people I knew. The core of the band really was the piano player Angie Sankool and the bass player Debbie Novak and myself. And I say that was the core because we had more drummers than Spinal Tap. It was kind of a revolving door, but I had met Angie through a mutual friend, and Deb we found in time-honored fashion through the local music paper. I don't even know if that happens anymore, where there was an ad or you put in, you need a bass player. But the vocal blend that developed between us was something distinctive. And the music, I would say, is... I grew up identifying a lot with sort of country-flavored rock. A lot of my favorite bands, the Grateful Dead, the Eagles, even to a degree Crosby, Stills, and Nash with the folk influence there too. But that particular kind of California country rock sound is a particular area that speaks to me. And when I started writing songs, I think that was one of the first influences. And people in New York said, "Oh, well, this is country," which I didn't really think it was at the time, but I started listening to contemporary country and said, I can relate to this. So this is in the early mid-90s, which I think was a really great era for country music in terms of songwriting and distinctive artists. And so I started adding some of that music in, and then we found out, oh, people dance to this. So you find the dance clubs, and not only do you get to play for dancers, but you're playing for a full room and getting paid on a Tuesday night, instead of having to go and play the dive bar where all the bands play, where you drag your friends out to, pay too much for beer. It's hard to be cool in the music scene when you're playing in line dance clubs, but we snuck in our music, and then when we made recordings, just put everything behind it to get it out there. And at that time, you're hoping that with radio play, that if somebody really likes it, that gives you a relationship in a new city, and and this is again the way it used to work, but and still does for some people. And that was how the Nashville attention came in. Was that a now no longer here radio station called the Phoenix, which was sort of a adult alternative, but before they were using that designation, I think, for that market. But playing singer-songwriter music primarily. And the thing that really is funny is the program director told us that he added the song because it was really strongly focused on the vocal harmonies, and his daughter was in the car with him who loved boy bands, like the Backstreet Boys, and she heard the harmonies and responded to that, and he said, oh, and so he listened to it again. They put the song in rotation. And the thing that's interesting, though, or maybe interesting is the wrong word, you would think then that, okay, regular airplay in Nashville, well, somebody in Nashville must be paying attention to this. And we did get the write-up in Music Row. But I think the sound was, for Nashville, and particularly at that time, it was like we were polished enough to sit alongside what Nashville was doing, but not so polished that Nashville said, yes, this is how we do it. And of course, rawness in its way is appealing. Sometimes we want lots of raw. And I think that the sound we were aiming for was what I would describe as a country Fleetwood Mac. And I think a few years later, you had bands like Lady Antebellum and Little Big Town that did exactly that, I would say. So I'm not saying we were ahead of our time or anything like that, but it seemed like at the time we were doing this, the only bands in country music, it was still the model basically of Alabama, Restless Heart, where the musicianship is fairly, I hate to say generic, I don't want to insult anybody, but I mean, the Nashville way has always been that studio musicians play on the albums and the road band goes on tour. And so just like with the Wrecking Crew and with Motown, you have a handful of musicians playing on virtually all the records that come out. So there is a sameness, where in rock music the band plays, so the style of the band is more distinctive.
Attention from the Nashville airwaves and Music Row and recording albums. I wanted to move on to that point where the band decided to split and go their separate ways. Why did that happen, and what made you decide to pursue a solo music career? And can you tell us about that distribution deal and the 2 albums you released as a solo artist?
Well, I think ultimately it came down to my wanting to make my own decisions more effectively. I hate to say that. I mean, one learns a lot about, hopefully, one learns a lot about oneself when you're in charge of something. And I think I learned to be a much better band leader over the course of running that group. It really was always my project, as opposed to, the image we all have of a band, which is a bunch of young people that get together and take on the world. And, every great band I can think of, a band really is like a gang. Whereas this was not so much like that, but it's the modern reality. In many bands, you have someone who's writing the songs and basically being the business engine behind it, and then everyone is coming, and they do it because they want to be a part of it, but I think I was looking to do more. I think some of the band members didn't really want to play outside, away from home. Some really had other music they wanted to play. It was a variety of reasons. But I think I had chafed a little bit, and this is where I talk about, getting back to learning about yourself. Like I said, it was hard to be hip doing what we were doing in that environment at that time. And so there was a little bit of a part of me that was going, yeah, you think I'm just, what, this uncool cowboy thing? Well, okay, I'm making a guitar record. And I threw everything I had into the next 2 solo albums to musically explore. And that did, though, start to at least stake out some territory. And the deal came from when I started traveling and essentially mapped out a route between New York and New Orleans, including Nashville in the middle, and you start circling and hitting places in between. Memphis was part of that circle as well. We had referred to that earlier. And had been introduced to the folks at Louisiana Red Hot Records who were looking to expand what they were doing. In retrospect, nothing I was doing had much to do with anything else they did. And it potentially could have gone somewhere, except that this was 2005, and I moved to Nashville the day after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And so that upset a lot of things because I'd been building these relationships in South Louisiana, and when I left New York, the 2 places my wife and I were considering was Nashville and New Orleans. So there was a reset that came at that point, because compound losing a good chunk of what was going on in your business momentum, being in a new city, now needing to find work, now needing to make new contacts and reestablish. And this is where the teaching studio, the seed of that really was planted, because I did start teaching right away, at least neighborhood music school, a couple of 8-year-olds taking guitar lessons, which is fine. But that grew from there until the university job fell in my lap. But that had been after going back and forth. I had quit the music school to concentrate on a performing project that was suddenly gaining a lot of momentum in 2008 called Good Souls. And this was primarily a duo. And again, the harmony singing, myself and a female singer, Brianna Hardiman. And sometimes you work with another musician, singer, and there's something about the energy of what you bring to it plus the energy of what they bring to it, which multiplies instead of just sitting side by side. And I've been fortunate enough to work with a number of people like that over the course of my life. Those are the people you gravitate to, because it's not hard to figure out what to do against each other. You're just immediately on the same page. And Brianna and I sang like that. It was very, very satisfying to sing harmony with her. And right around, we put an album together, we're about to release it, and she had personal circumstances, we had personal circumstances at home, everything got complicated. This is how the music industry goes. I was offered a university job the week after this project broke up. So here was a place to land. Just through an acquaintance, I was teaching one class to get health insurance. And that led into the full-time offer, and I spent several years doing that. Long enough to know that I, again, wanted to make my own decisions. Are we seeing a theme here?
You mentioned about changing locations, and that leads beautifully to my next question. What made you decide to move to Nashville from living in New York? What were your experiences and impressions of the New York music scene? And what made you decide to make that change, that life-changing decision?
Well, my experience of New York, because we did live in the suburbs, so really Jackalope was a Long Island band and not a New York City band, and every bit of suburban scorn that then gets heaped upon you by the hipper city people, everything that goes with that. But when we did play in New York City, the scene at that time that was receptive to country or country-flavored music at the time was leaning more toward alternative country and even some of the punkier side You think stuff that maybe was called cowpunk in the 80s. So you had a lot of guys with tattoos who had been playing punk in 1982 who were now playing honky-tonk music in 1994. And so we were never quite rough-edged enough for that either. So never really found a place to play until we settled into the Rodeo Bar, which was really my favorite place in Manhattan to play, because it was not catering to either extreme of the people who wanted to line dance to very polished music and the people who wanted things to be very gritty and raw. It was more where sort of singer-songwriter oriented, what I suppose is now being called Americana rock music, was landing. But that was moving away really from mainstream country as I'm moving to Nashville. But Nashville was already a place where I'd started putting down relationships, and it felt like, rather than trying to figure out which clique in New York I needed to break into, just to start over in a new environment where I have lots of options, because as a competent guitarist, I know I can find work doing that, along with whatever else I had done for myself, running the band, teaching lessons and so forth. Any place with a thriving music community like that, you're going to find people to work with, and you hope for a degree of synergy that you're feeding each other.
You moved to Nashville back in 2005, and
Yes.
I wanted to ask you, what were your first impressions, and can you discuss finding a teaching job at a music store and early rehearsals with a band looking to play gigs during your first week?
Yes. So when I landed, I just knew that I needed to find something to do, and that I was in a place where there was lots of something. So I had, in effect, sort of stepped away from the path I had been on in the past couple of years as a emerging solo artist, however we want to look at that, because I felt like in this whole new set of opportunities, I'm not going to choose which one I'm looking for just yet. I want to see where I land. And the first thing that fell in my lap was this neighborhood music school, music store, which I was very thankful to have that. I had a couple of students, but so this is 2005, and social media at that point was MySpace. And MySpace was really very well organized for musicians, because you really could feature your work very prominently, and so you could use it as an early electronic press kit, and you could interact easily. So I had started connecting with people in Nashville months before I left. So when I got here, I already had gigs. I already had rehearsals lined up. So I'm rehearsing with this band, and we're trying to get in at Tootsie's, which is still down in the honky-tonk circuit, everybody knows Tootsie's. That's the world-famous Tootsie's Orchid Lounge. And so we rehearsed a set of music. The singer was a real powerhouse, Martina McBride, Pat Benatar kind of big voice singer. So it was a lot of fun to play that music. You could really get to rock and roll on the guitar a little bit. But we go, do the audition. The first date they offer, I'm already booked to teach. And now I'm in a crappy position, and which commitment am I going to keep? I kept the lessons, and I think that sort of set the direction from that point on. But, I have always felt that, and maybe this goes back to the musical omnivore, but Nashville is so full of creative people that, the best thing about being here, regardless of how one might feel about the culture itself because Music Row is one culture, and then the honky-tonks on Broadway are another culture, and there's really not any relationship between those two things. And then there is a rock and sort of alternative scene in East Nashville, which has nothing to do with either one of those things. But yet everyone is in still a relatively small community, and so there's a lot of interaction between everybody. That hasn't changed, it's just that it's gotten so much bigger.
Shortly, I want to move the clock forward in time to 2013. and establishing Nashville Guitar Guru. But before I do so, I wanted to come back to talking about musical education, because you taught music in a university music department. How do you look back at your experiences in university education, and what made you decide to leave that position and go on and work for yourself?
Well, when I was offered the position, I was really excited because I was sort of at a crossroads and looking for another opportunity. And it was an exciting prospect because it was a whole other area to explore. And to be honest, it was something that seemed legitimate in the sense that, okay, I'm not floundering around trying to make a project succeed. I have a position here to live up to, and this could grow into something. So I took it very seriously, and I learned a lot. It helped me organize my thinking in terms of a curriculum and how to approach. I had done this sort of thing teaching kids in the neighborhood before I came to Nashville. I had a busy teaching practice, and I had learned something about how to connect with people, but I'd never taught in the classroom before. And I really enjoyed the sort of performance aspect of teaching classes. On the other hand, I hate giving grades. And I learned that philosophically speaking, I would rather connect with someone in a way that gives them something they can continue to connect back to than guide them from point A to point B and nothing more, and strictly within these parameters offer my assessment based on this syllabus. That's the job. There's lots of talk in universities about outcomes, and the conversation in this country has been going on for a long time about the true value of a university education, and that conversation is getting very loud right now. And I suppose that I am taking it from more on the what one might call the liberal arts philosophy of saying that it's the experience of being exposed to things that opens the mind, makes a person well-rounded, and so forth. But when one is looking to pursue a career as a professional musician, then that kind of music school environment, like I went through, is good for creating the skill set that can then be applied to everything else. But without the entrepreneurial mindset, it doesn't work. If you are looking at music school as someone who wants to be an artist, has to put that aside for a while, I think, and look at it as skill building, or else the other side of it is you go through this process to become the artist. But you look at people, I mean, it's funny for an educator to talk about education this way, but I think it's more that I learned that some people are there to be there and get the degree, and I respect that. Some people are there because they are willing to actually submit themselves to a program, a kind of boot camp, and come out the other side formed into something else. And that's really satisfying to work with. But again, I have always, and again, we've established this theme, I seem to do better when I can make my own choices based on the assessments that I have of things, for better or for worse. And the reason I left the university was that I was brought on as a temporary appointment because one professor had passed away and another had been denied tenure and had to leave. And then they renewed my contract repeatedly. Clearly they liked me. When they finally announced the formal search, they did narrow down the whole search to myself and one other candidate. And the way they had worded the search, it was actually a music technology position. So I learned a whole lot about recording and audio and things like that because I had to. But it was very much a stay one step ahead of the class as I'm teaching myself situation. My boss calls me into his office and says, well, good news and bad news. The bad news is we didn't give you the job, but we didn't hire the other guy either. And I said, why not? He said, well, we couldn't find anyone that met the description we were looking for. They were looking for a unicorn, which I knew, or I recognized that. But he said, well, you can come back next year. We'll extend your contract another year, and you can apply for it again, and we'll coach you through how to do it. but I would understand if you wanted to tell me no, but think about it. So rather than saying no at that moment, I came back the next day and told him no.
Nearly a decade ago, and we talk about next your business venture, 2013, you established the Nashville Guitar Guru, your own private teaching studio. What made you decide to do this? And why did you decide to focus on a business in musical tutorage and education?
I wanted to formalize what I was doing. I had said that when I got the university position, I felt like I was doing something that my mom could say I had a job. You know what I mean? There's this degree of feeling like, okay, I'm an adult now, right? But I want to be organized about what I'm doing because it helps keep me productive and it allows me to make a living. That it, to a degree, it's really just being, I guess, more of an adult about how you organize your life. And it's possible to be very sort of haphazard about being a gig worker, which to a degree I still am or would be, except that getting into the publishing and workshops angle essentially is diversifying what I'm doing, giving me opportunities for passive income with publishing and writing. And it creates an umbrella that can include everything I do, because I can put out something educational or I can put out an album as an artist, and I have at least a community of people that have been paying attention to this musical area I'm creating. And that hopefully now, instead of being, I have to choose between being a performer or creator or a teacher, that part of the reason I create my own music is just as an illustration of, well, this is why I teach, this is what I do, and you want to learn how to do it too.
I wanted to ask you next how the business has developed over the last 9 years. Can you share with us how you've managed to increase student numbers and how online teaching boomed during the global pandemic?
In the beginning, getting more students was more or less what it always was when I started teaching in the neighborhood and I'm putting flyers up on the bulletin board at the grocery store. So it's just getting out, meeting as many people as possible and talking about what you do. But I did start doing workshops, and I was fortunate enough to get to work with the Nashville Songwriters Association fairly early on, which is a training and advocacy organization that mentors emerging songwriters and then also lobbies for songwriters' business interests with the government, and they've been involved with some of these new decisions that have increased royalty rates and things like that. So they had educational events, and I was brought in to give workshops, and so I started to meet a lot of people in the songwriting community, which I was entering myself because I was also writing, and playing around town a lot, and people would hear me play and say, oh, you teach? I want to learn how to do that. So that grew organically, but in terms of growing the business, it really did have to do with looking at the internet and saying this offers a degree of freedom and mobility in the sense that if I have an internet presence, people can find me from all over and I can work with people from everywhere. When COVID hit and the whole world went online, I had already been teaching on Zoom for several years. I started using Skype in 2010. So I was comfortable with the dynamic of working online, and I had also done some online teaching when I was teaching in the universities, and I understood how to manage a learning management system and so forth. And it creates a virtual home and a virtual umbrella that all this stuff could go under. And I also recognize as a businessman that, I mean, I have always, even when I was in college, I was playing promoter. I was putting together concerts and inviting my friends to do it because I wanted to create an opportunity as opposed to just waiting for one. So this is more or less always what I've done. And now, instead of that open mindset of saying I'm a blank slate, I am open to whatever comes my way, now it's we've established a direction and a territory. So how do I make this structure richer, stronger, more secure? Well, I'm adding more material, writing my book, The Perpetual Beginner, publishing solo guitar music, releasing new albums. And all of that is adding to a catalog. That part's important to me, and I think that's the way to scale, is to continue doing that and with the workshops and the internet reaching bigger and bigger audiences.
I wanted to talk about your recent musical pursuits, some of which you've already cited, which include publishing a book, a set of original guitar pieces, two collections of original guitar arrangements, and the release of a solo album. Can you give us details on these projects and your achievements? And do you have any future goals?
The solo guitar aspect started to come back just before the pandemic. I should back up to the book. The book is called The Perpetual Beginner, and I had always wanted to write a book. Perhaps there's a degree of vanity in some of this that I said, I want to write a book. But it's going back to what I was saying about how as a teacher, I would like to connect with somebody and impart something to them that they carry away with them. The book is essentially telling the story of a number of times, incidents, situations where that happened. So I'm relating stories of people I interacted with and the musical setting that was going on, and how that either taught me a lesson or built a skill or led to something else that I continue as a professional to rely on 30 plus years later. And the book was received very, very well. It was very, very satisfying and exciting to go through the process of creating it. And to this day, it's still the most successful thing that I've ever done. So this is the fall of 2019. 2020 comes around. I'm planning on traveling and doing workshops, and COVID shuts everything down. Well, I had written a book about Perpetual Beginner being not only open all the time and being willing to admit you don't know things, but returning to that again and again. And the classical guitar and playing fingerstyle was something that I always felt was sort of unfinished business because I left it behind when I had my hand injury in the 90s. And now COVID, I'm home and I have time on my hands. And so I started practicing classical guitar again, really getting a lot of satisfaction out of it. And in the process of doing that, starting to write pieces myself, which is something I had done when I was a college student and abandoned. So rebuilding the technique itself on the guitar, revisiting that music led to creating this other music, which then in that, because I was using it as exercises myself, I saw an opportunity to share them in that way. Just in the way that in classical music, lots and lots of composers put out composed music that you might listen to just to enjoy it, but that was written for a student. And Bach did it, and Mozart did it, and there's lots and lots of examples of that, and in the guitar world as well. So there was a part of me that said I've always wanted to do that, and that's where that led to. The Choogle album that followed after that was having a bunch of songs that had been kicking around but not been recorded, and I hadn't done a solo album since 2016. I had about 3 people that I saw on a regular basis through most of 2020, and it just so happened that 2 of them were a bass player and a drummer. So we were doing a lot of jamming together, and the third one is a recording engineer. So it was a pretty natural thing for that to turn into an album. And in terms of future, what's coming next, I just finished mixing an album called Songs Without Words, which is taking the music from this set of guitar etudes, exercises that I published, and playing those songs with a band or playing those songs with other layered instruments. So some of them are bass and drums with the guitar, some of them are multiple guitars, some just have percussion. And it was a musical experiment, but I was so, I really liked the music. I got very excited about it, and I felt like here was an opportunity now to move into a different area of sort of atmospheric music, which is something that's been appealing to me in the last couple of years. So that album's done.
So far, our discussion this evening, or shall I say this afternoon, has solely been focused on your musical journey from the very foundations, your discovery of music, you becoming aware of it and loving music and performing, musical education, performing in a band back in the 90s decade, I wanted to kind of move away from that if I can with this final question, because outside of your busy life as a business person, as a music tutor, as I mentioned as well, you're a married man. How did you meet your wife, and do you have a family? And what do you like to do to relax? And are there any creative areas you'd like to explore outside of music?
My wife and I met on a gig. I was playing in a band, and like lots of bands, we had a few people that were sort of hangers-on that would come to all the gigs, and they'd help you load the gear out, and they kind of enjoyed being just with the band. There was some cachet they felt that came with that. And one day he had a blind date with my wife, and he brought her to see me. And we didn't connect exactly that night. We chatted a little bit, and my wife says now that the impression we both gave each other was that we were both smart aleck, which is true. And she thought I was with the girl who I was singing with. A month later, she didn't end up with this guy, but they met at one of the band's gigs. And so she comes walking in, I'm up on the stage, and I saw her, and she waved, and I didn't remember her at first, and I thought, oh, well, she's cute. Wait, she's waving at me. Oh, who's that? She comes and sits down by the stage, waiting for our friend to come in, and now she's looking at me. And then she catches me looking at her, and we haven't really spent much time apart since. So that was one of those things. And then she has been involved in the music career from the beginning as really my best sounding board, and she is always, even if painfully, honest with me, and she's usually right. And she's been a big part of helping shape the business of it too, because the conversations we have make it easier to make decisions, make things clear. So we have a good relationship that way. And I'm sorry, the second question.
Yeah, the second question was, do you have children?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and the final part was, would you like to do something creatively outside
sorry about that.
of music? No, not a problem at all.
So my wife has two kids that were 7 and 12 when we met. So I have no blood children of my own, but my stepkids both have kids. Each one of them has a daughter. So I am a grandpa, and I am over the moon about it, much more than if you had asked me the day before the older of them was born, are you ready to be a grandpa? And I would have thought, I am not old. I am not a grandpa, but let me tell you, I am all in as far as that goes. The thing I love most outside of the guitar, outside of music, is outdoors, and particularly being, I'm not going to say the wilderness because I am not the rugged outdoorsman, but I love to hike. I like being in natural environments. I find it very gratifying to be surrounded by green things while your feet are doing something rhythmically on the ground. And it actually occurs to me that hiking is actually a rhythmic activity. And it goes back to even, I think, something connected in my brain to the way I enjoy the percussive aspect of the guitar. But it is one of my favorite things, and so I love to get out and spend a couple of days in the mountains or off in some more remote environment, partly for the quiet. And one of the things that I get to do fairly often is I make videos for a company online called Jamplay that is a library of guitar lessons, and people subscribe. So I will go out to their studio in northern Colorado a couple of times a year for a video shoot. And they are in the northernmost city of the Front Range in Colorado. So when you head north from Fort Collins, you are off in open country right away, heading up into Wyoming. And exploring up there is, for someone who grew up in the Northeast and in a fairly enclosed environment, those spaces, an open horizon, and that landscape has always just done something for me. So traveling to those places, getting outside, is something really important to me. And as far as something I'd like to do that I don't do, honestly, I have this ongoing idea about redoing the beds outside of the house and planting a garden and sort of landscaping it and creating and shaping all of this. I have a couple of friends that do landscape design, and I just think it's a cool thing. I don't have anywhere near the time to do it, but I am at least getting ambitious enough to say, all right, come winter, I'm at least going to get out a shovel and dig out this piece and see what I can do.
David, we move on to the final part of the interview, and we ask every interviewee these same questions to wrap the interview, and I guess to find out things we've not already established about you. You don't need to think about these in any detail. They're the 13 questions.
Okay.
Here we go. So firstly, can I ask, what is your favorite pastime?
My favorite pastime would be hiking.
We talk so much about music and, of course, your early influences, and you mentioned so many names from so many different genres. But now we talk about film. If you had to choose a favorite film, what would it be and why?
Oh, wow. Okay. That's interesting because one can go in different directions, right? Because there's serious film. I mean, I think there are films that had a real impact. I will say, I think I'm going to dodge the question by saying this is an easy answer. That I tell my students that if you want to be in a band, you have to see 3 movies, which are all great movies. You have to see This Is Spinal Tap. You have to see The Commitments.
Yeah.
And you have to see Almost Famous.
Yeah.
And that if you that will give you a picture of some of what that experience is. And I love those so much because every moment of all 3 of them, well, maybe not I'm a Golden God part of Almost Famous, but I resonated with all of those. It was kind of a dodgy answer, I appreciate that, but when my mind just started to do this, that was where I settled.
3 good selections, and of course, all musical at the same time. So I like your choices there. We move on to novelists now. Who would you cite as your favorite novelist?
There's a handful. I had an English teacher who pegged me in high school and said, you have to read Kerouac. And she was absolutely right. I mean, blew the top of my head off like a lot of people talk about. And he remains a favorite. And then I mentioned learning about my heritage, and I started to explore Spanish writers and Latin American writers in my 20s, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez just completely blew my mind. And then over the last 20 years or so, the people that I would say I've read their work over and over again, Haruki Murakami, wonderful Japanese novelist, Barbara Kingsolver, who's also a naturalist and writes a lot about the natural world in her stories, and Thomas Pynchon, who I still know I will never understand, but I enjoy the complete absurdity of it.
If you could have chosen a different profession, maybe in a different lifetime, what would it be?
I ended up moving in an intellectual sort of direction with music and writing and things like that. And it didn't occur to me that I should be working with my body. And, I talk about the gardening thing, and I have a friend that he's not a landscape designer, but he's the guy who puts in the trees, and there's just something cool about that. And like he says, I get to work outside all day long. Whether that's a career choice I might have taught, but now just thinking about that now in terms of, so of all the things you could get paid to do, stand outside and say, yeah, put that there, okay, I'll help you carry it, yeah, that works. Maybe that's a silly way to put it, I'm rambling. But
yeah, who in life next would you say has been your greatest inspiration?
Oh, wow. Greatest inspiration, because immediately that goes to musical heroes and things like that, but there's so much more to it than that. But I think when I look at, one has aspirations as a young person, and I think I've made it pretty clear that I was an ambitious one and a fairly headstrong one, thinking I want to do things my way, right? But you look at someone like, say, a Paul McCartney, who is world famous. You can't really be much more famous than Paul McCartney, but yet, and regardless of how he may live, that there is still a sense that this is a guy who wrote a bunch of good songs and did well, and is still someone that you could say, this is not someone who sees themselves as above the rest of the world. And I admire people like that, who achieve that kind of level of success. But, the fact that he did his last album with essentially unknown musicians, relatively speaking, to remain open like that in whatever field you're in, I think is just something to aspire to. And that was a name that popped into my head first, I suppose, but there are so many people, and I think those are the things, that I look at and say, when you've achieved a pinnacle of success in who you are, what kind of a person do you end up being? And so now as I'm thinking about that, and I say, so Jimmy Carter, who was our president in the 70s and really was not thought of as being a great president, but the guy was still president, first of all. But he's revered because he has spent all his time since there in public service and never stopped. And that's the kind of person, that you hope you continue to be, especially, as young people, we are all self-serving because we have to be. We have to claw out our part of the world, or how else do you establish a life for yourself? And then at some point, when you achieve what feels like some degree of, okay, I've built a life here, well, now what does that mean in how you deal with everybody else?
Newspapers now. Do you read a newspaper? And if so, which one?
I read a lot online, frankly, but in terms of things on paper that I still actually subscribe to, I do still subscribe to the New Yorker magazine, and which I've read for years and years, and I think I have a degree of nostalgia about it. But in terms of a newspaper, it's been a very long time since I think I sat. And I've always liked, though, how every big city used to have its entertainment rag that was always just a little bit askew and a little bit sleazy in the things that they would cover. But if you were playing music, those were the people you wanted to write about you.
Up next, cuisine, but what would you choose as your favorite food?
I am partial to the sort of New Mexico style of not quite Mexican food, but Mexican influenced. One learns eventually the distinction between the different kinds, but that seems to be the sort of sub area that I love the most. That part of the world. So let's call it Southwestern.
Who would you cite as your favorite cultural icon? It could be maybe a political figure, someone from history, maybe a religious icon, somebody who's changed the world in a particular way or form.
You ask deep questions. There's a lot to go into there. But I think as someone with a wide range of interests and someone that wants to keep learning, I think about Isaac Newton, I think about Michelangelo, I think about these men that were scientists and artists. And I think that that's really, again, in terms of things to admire and aspire to, talk about ways to change the world. And both of those are powerful ways to do that. And to have an impact in both of those ways.
Two very interesting choices. Not so deep now. What would you say is your favorite curse word and why?
I grew up in New York. Fuck is every other. It's a very flexible word, but yeah, it's if you come where I grew up, we're fairly profane.
What would you
I have
say?
to edit myself in the South.
What would you say next when you get a chance to go somewhere and travel? What is your favorite place or holiday destination?
There are a lot, and there's so many places that I want to go, but I can tell you the places that stand out in my mind is definitely, I mentioned New Mexico, and that high desert mountain environment is something that is just so. I mean, even Jackalope Junction kind of came from, I had a fascination with the southwest of this country, and that high desert climate and the imagery of it and the way that it intersects with all of our cowboy mythology. And I also am a great big fan of the Grateful Dead, and there's so much of this sort of Western imagery in their music, and so there's something about that part of the world. But I will also say that I've been to the Riviera Maya in Mexico twice, and I could spend lots more time there very, very easily.
The question you never want to ask a musician: who is your favorite music artist, and what would you cite as your favorite album?
I can't narrow down to one, again, the musical polymath, but I can tell you if I had my top, I would say Led Zeppelin, The Grateful Dead, Genesis, Steely Dan.
And is there an album you maybe go back to that reminds you of a particular phase or period in your life?
Grateful Dead, American Beauty.
Okay. And the final two, David, what would you say is your greatest achievement to date?
That at 54 years old, I can say that I have made a life for myself in music
And
against considerable odds and my parents' considerable objections.
the last question, David Isaacs, how do you wish to be remembered?
I wish to be remembered as someone that valued what he was given and valued giving back.
A nice short answer that closes the final chapter, but not the end chapter, of course, in your further career and life. But thank you for joining me, I say, this afternoon in Nashville to share your journey. I found it a really interesting and nice interview. I really enjoyed the last hour,
Well,
and
thank you.
we've spoken about so much, and it was interesting early on to talk about the early revelation in your childhood and decisions you've made along the way. I wish you more continued success
Thank you.
on your musical journey. But lastly, how do we find out more about David Isaacs, the book publisher, the composer, the music tutor? Where do we go? Where do we find out more?
The web home is NashvilleGuitarGuru.com, and that's also the handle on all the social media. So the YouTube channel is Nashville Guitar Guru, as is Facebook and Instagram. I am relatively easy to find in that way, which is a nice plus to having spent a lot of time concentrating on the internet over the last 10 years.
Thanks again for your time. Thanks for sharing your story, and all the very best with all your future goals, endeavors, and what life brings.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This was a really fun interview. It was nice to go so deep, but cover so many different areas. It's nice to explore some different parts of the conversation.
Thank you.